Okay guys, so in the next segment, I want to show you guys a high level overview of how the Linux file system is structured. And I'll show you by basically bringing up the full file structure in the terminal and then break down each directory underneath the file system. So let's go down and hit CD and then the /, and this represents the root of the file system. And every file included within the operating system is stored under this one location. It's similar to the Windows operating system, how everything is structured under the C drive. Well, it's the same thing, but a little bit different within the Linux operating system. So let's press enter there. And what I want to do is run the ls command, and then I'll run the -l option. And this will give us the full structure of the operating system. And I'm gonna scroll up right fast a little bit just to put it all in so that everything is listed out. And I'll go through and break down each one of these folders. And like I said, this will be a high overview because I don't want to go too deep and confuse new users of the Linux operating system. I just basically want to explain what a lot of these folders are used for, and this will give you a better understanding of how the operating system works. Okay, and the first directory I want to show you guys is the bin directory. And this is where most of your binary files are stored. Now, this means Linux terminal commands and core utilities, such as the cd command, which we just used, the pwd command, which is print working directory, which I showed you guys a little earlier, as well as the move command, and so on. Pretty much this is where all those binary files are stored. Now the next directory is the boot directory, and this is a very important directory, and you don't want to go playing around in this directory. This is where all the needed files for Linux to boot are kept. And a lot of people that are used to running Linux, they typically separate this directory on a different partition from the remainder of the operating system, especially when you're working or doing dual booting. But that's a little high level for you guys. I just wanted to give you guys an overview of what this folder is for, and just a little bit more of an idea of what's located in this directory is the boot files, as well as grub most of the time, which is a small program that allows you to select the operating system and boot the operating system. Now the next directory is CD-ROM, and that's obviously where your CD drive is stored. So anytime you put a disk into your Linux operating system, it'll show up under CD-ROM. Now the next directory I want to really talk about is the dev directory. That's the next directory down, and this is where all your physical devices are mounted. So all your hard drives, USB, optical drives, and the reason I say optical drives, CD drives, because they can be mounted under this location or stored under this location as well. It just all depends on the different distributions. Different distributions store things in different places. Sometimes they have a extra directory here and there. That's why I didn't talk much about the CD-ROM folder, which is obviously that's what that's for, the CD drive. But typically that's stored, and depending on the distribution, the CD-ROM drives are stored under dev as well. But all your hard drives are stored in this location. They're actually mounted from that location. And also, if you have like multiple partitions on a single drive, those will be stored under this location as well. And you'll see that once you start really diving in how to partition a hard drive for your Linux operating system. Now, the next directory I want to explain to you guys is the etc directory. And it basically stands for etc. But this is where all the configuration files are stored. And this is for all the applications that are installed on the Linux operating system. So let's say you want to install an Apache server. Well, they'll have configuration files stored under the etc directory. Or if you want to set up MySQL, or if you're trying to modify your SSH connections or your configuration for your SSH server, then the configuration file is underneath there. And most of your configuration files have an extension of conf, so CONF. Okay, and so the next directory is basically the home directory. And I kind of explained this when I was showing you guys how to navigate the Linux file system by using the cd command. Well, the home directory is where all the username folders are stored. So anytime a new user is created on the system, depending on if that option is selected or not, a home folder is actually created. And this is where all your documents and photos and video files, they're all stored under that user's home directory, which is stored under this home folder. Now, the next folder is the lib directory. And this is where binaries are kept. And a lot of times you'll notice that many times when installing Linux packages, additional libraries are automatically downloaded. And they almost always end up in the lib directory somewhere. And just to simply put it, these files or files that are needed for your program to work on Linux. And just to relate it to Windows, you can think of this folder is somewhat an equivalent of the program files folder on Windows. But keep in mind, it's not 100% exactly the same. And just to explain these other folders that are in there that says lib32 is basically if you have a 32-bit piece of software, this is where the libraries are stored for that, as well as system 64-bit software. That is where those libraries files are stored as well. And then there's a libx32, and this contains library files as well. Now the media directory, which is the next directory, I'm going to skip over that lost and found. That's just a typical folder that's in AEXT4 partition. But the media directory is basically another place where external devices such as USB drives, whenever you plug them in, they'll pop up in there, or you can mount them in there. And it all depends on the Linux distribution. Sometimes you may not even see that media directory. You'll see a mount directory, which is the next one I wanted to show you guys. And this is basically a placeholder folder used for mounting folders or drives. And this is where I typically mount external drives or remote drives to my operating system. And like I stated, it's simply a placeholder. And a lot of times I'll create multiple folders underneath that depending on where I'm connecting to. Let's say I'm connecting to a shared drive, or I want to mount a shared drive on another server that's within my network, and I want it to always mount to that location. I'll create a folder for it, and I'll name it like the server name or something, or the share name, and then I'll set it up where that shared drive is mounted at that location every single time the system boots up. Now the next folder is the opt directory, and this is for optional software for the system, and that's the simplest way to put it. And I never have used the opt directory for anything, but it all depends on the distribution you're using as well. Now the proc directory is an important directory as well. This is the processes folder where a lot of systems information is represented as files. And it basically provides a way for the Linux kernel to send and receive information from various processes running in the Linux environment. Now the next directory is the root directory, and this is different from the actual root location. This is basically the home directory for the root account. You know, like we have the home folder and then Josh, where there is a built-in user called root that has full permissions to pretty much everything on the system. With Ubuntu, they have this account disabled by default, but it has its own home directory. So if you ever logged into that root account, which I don't recommend, this is where the files are stored for the root directory. So if you download something, it'll default to the root directory while you're running as the root user. Now the next directory is the run directory, and this is where a lot of drives are auto mounted when you like plug in a USB drive. And this is something that's really only relevant to desktop environments. So if you have a desktop environment installed, a lot of times they'll have the run directory under your root, where a lot of those drives that are like auto mounted to the system, they'll pop up under run. And you can unmount them from that location. And let's say you want to mount them under the mount directory or the MNT directory, then you can easily do that. But they put that there for newer modern Linux distributions so that when you plug in a USB drive, it'll automatically mount at that location. I don't normally use it, but it is there for a lot of users that are transitioning from different operating systems just to make it more user friendly. Now the next directory is sbin, and it's similar to the bin directory, except that it's dedicated to certain commands that can only be run by the root user or super user. And this directory kind of depends on the distribution as well. Now the temp directory, this is basically where files are temporarily stored, and most of the time when you shut down the system, it'll delete those files from that directory. And I actually missed one of the directories, and that's snap. Snap is a new way of actually installing applications by somewhat containerizing the application using, they call it snap packages, and you'll see that a lot in Ubuntu systems. But this is where that is stored. Now, the US OR directory, it basically contains files and utilities that are shared between users. That's why I call it, I just said the US OR, but I typically call it the user directory. That's simply what that is. It's just utilities that are shared between users. And then the var directory is basically where variable data is kept. And it's usually system logs, but can also include other types of data as well. Like for instance, if you're running this thing as a server, then the default location for Apache is var, and then there's a folder underneath that called www and then HTML. So that's where that's actually stored as far as files. And then they also have log files within there. Like if you're running a server and you have an Apache server setup, then you typically will see your log files under var. And there's a directory called log. And then also under the root directory, you'll see a swap file, depending on if you have swap on the system. And typically if you install it without making any changes or modifying the way the system is set up, you just take the defaults when you're going through the installation, then you'll typically have a swap file. And this is just an extra place to store things that are stored in memory that haven't been accessed for a while. So let's say you have a browser open, but then you go over and start working on something else, and you eventually get to the point where it needs to store, your system needs to store some information that you have open that you're not currently using. Well, sometimes it'll write it to the swap file. So that's essentially what that is. But that's pretty much the Linux file structure. I just wanted to cover it this way just to make it super simple, where I just talked about each one of the directories and you can see them on the system as I go through them. So let's go on and move on to the next section.